Once again, welcome everyone. My name is Srebrenica. I'm a PhD candidate at the Diversity Studies Center Oslo, and I will be moderating today's panel. And the title of today's panel is From Srebrenica to Utøya, Places where the unthinkable happened and what comes after. The purpose of this panel is twofold. The first thing it is meant to do is to facilitate for a comparison and discussion of the challenges involved when attempting to transform a place where the unthinkable happened into something more. The second thing this panel is meant to do is to discuss to what extent the genocide in Srebrenica and the terror attack on Utøya can be regarded as Islamophobically motivated incidents, and in extension to that, if and how this should be reflected in the stories about what happened and on the memorial sites themselves. To discuss these matters, we have assembled what I think is fair to call both a necessary and sufficient panel. On the right, beginning with you, Emir. Emir Suljagic is a journalist, writer, researcher, and former Deputy Minister of Defense in Bosnia-Herzegovina, who holds a PhD in political science from the University of Hamburg and teaches international relations at the International University of Sarajevo. He is a witness and survivor of the genocide in Srebrenica, where he worked as an English interpreter for the United Nations. His memoir, Postcards from the Grave, is the first account of a Srebrenica survivor to be published in English and was subsequently published in 8 other languages, including Norwegian. And since 2019, Emir has held the position of the director of the Srebrenica Genocide Memorial. Thank you so much for being here, Emir.
Thank you for having me here. I think you have another guest.
Then we have Jørgen. Jørgen from Frydnes has 12 years of experience from Doctors Without Borders, both as a project manager and as a board member. He is currently a board member of the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, and last year he became the youngest ever to become a member of the Norwegian Nobel Committee. He has been the daily manager of Utøya since 2011, and last year he published the book No Man is an Island, which is a personal account of the process involved in reclaiming Utøya. Last year he also received Fritt Ord's honors reward for, I quote, transforming a place of terror and mass killings into an arena of knowledge, discussion, and resistance. Thank you for being here again.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Iselin Frydenlund. Iselin holds a PhD in the history of religion from the University of Oslo and is currently functioning as a professor of religious studies at MF, the Norwegian School of Theology, Religion, and Society. She has written extensively on the topic of Islamophobia, particularly in Sri Lanka and Myanmar, and is currently leading a project funded by the Norwegian Research Council, namely the Intersect project, which aims to investigate how Islamophobic beliefs and narratives travel across national and cultural contexts. Thank you for being here, Iselin.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will spend the first half of this panel discussion mostly between Emir and Jørgen, and then after half an hour or so, Iselin will pitch in with her with a prepared note on Islamophobia. And in the end, we will have a Q&A session, and it will be possible to ask questions in whatever language you like. I think you can find a suitable translator somewhere in the audience. Okay, let's begin with place and how place is tied to story. And let's begin with you, Emir, about the parts that make up the whole of Srebrenica. So if I ask you, or my question to you is, what are the places of Srebrenica? Let's begin there.
Well, okay. Well, first of all, good afternoon to you all. Thank you for being here. And I understand and I appreciate you coming here because it's a working day and it's the middle of a working day. So to go back to your question, the first thing, and as you said, I was appointed director of the memorial back in 2019, and it was the first thing that I wanted to do when I got out of Srebrenica, when I got out there, was to literally try and get out of this physical focus on Srebrenica, on the location where the former UN base was, and I'm fine. I'm not.
It doesn't work.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
You don't.
Okay. All right. So, you know, when people say Srebrenica, they usually focus on July 11th, 1995, and they focused on the, you know, there is very specific and very particular imagery coming out of Srebrenica on that day. Ratko Mladic walking into the town, looking at the camera, saying the time has come for us to take the revenge against the Turks. Then, you know, moving forward, Ratko Mladic in Potocari, just outside the UN base, giving out candy. So this is the kind of imagery that you know, and this imagery has caused a quite unnecessary focus on that particular location. And it has confused people a lot. So people actually think that everything that happened in Srebrenica happened on July 11th. What we know as the genocide operation at Srebrenica, and I refer to it as genocide operation because it took part within the context of 3.5 years long attempt to eradicate the Bosniak Muslim population, to wipe off the Bosnian state from the map. So what we know as Srebrenica genocide operation is something that is a process that took place starting on July 11th and ending in October 1995, when the last mass graves were reburied and the remains scattered into so-called secondary and in some cases even tertiary mass graves, to the extent that some individual victims, or remains of some individual victims have actually been found in 5, 6, up to 12 different locations, up to 12 different mass graves, because bodies were scattered using heavy machinery. And that's, you know, not the most precise instrument, obviously. That's one thing. The other thing is, Srebrenica didn't really happen in Srebrenica. You know, Srebrenica genocide operation didn't really happen in Srebrenica. It happened in places like Bratunac. It happened in the vicinity of Zvornik, which is some 40. Some victims were killed 50 or 60 kilometers away from the town of Srebrenica itself. And we recently found a mass grave. When I say we, I don't refer to the Srebrenica Memorial Center, but there's an institution in Bosnia dealing with the missing persons. That's another issue that we're dealing with. The Missing Persons Institute recently located a mass grave of victims from Srebrenica some 125 kilometers from Srebrenica, just actually very close to Sarajevo in Kalinovic. And when talking about that, there are actually very specific 5 locations where where mass executions took place. And these mass executions took place once, in an agricultural warehouse in the vicinity of Bratunac, at a dam in the vicinity of Zvornik, in something that is very unique to Yugoslav socialism that was known as House of Culture in the village of Pilica, in a former military economy known as Branjevo, and a piece of in a part of a Drina riverbank in a place called Kozluk. So these are the 5 places where, but Srebrenica is also geographically very much dislocated, because hundreds, if not thousands, of people were killed in the woods while on the move. Their remains were scattered on the surface for years. We still, part of what we do in Srebrenica, at the Srebrenica Memorial, is actually retracing the steps of this long death march from Srebrenica to Tuzla, and we're still, 26 years later, 27 years later, we're still finding personal possessions of individual victims who perished on that trek. One of our recent exhibitions was dedicated to that, and is actually centered on shoes that we found on that trek 26 years later in the woods. So in a way, Srebrenica, has been unnecessarily, the whole story, the whole narrative has been unnecessarily focused on Srebrenica. On the other hand of this narrative is the fact that the siege, what happened in July 1905, did not take place in political, military, social, even if you want, cultural vacuum. It took place within the context of the siege of the Bosniak Muslim population in eastern Bosnia, and that itself was part of a wider, as I said, attempt to eradicate Bosniak Muslims. We tend to forget the siege of Sarajevo. The siege of Sarajevo is probably the single most important event or process of the dissolution of Yugoslavia. We tend to not see the camps of Prijedor. Srebrenica has been such a blot in this attack on Bosnia that a lot of other stuff has been relegated to sort of secondary importance, although that you cannot even say that. But anyway, if we are talking about geography of Srebrenica, yes, of course, there is the geography of the siege itself, and what preceded the siege, and then there is a very specific geography of the mass execution of the actual massacre, and it, as I said, it took place in a confined environment, impenetrable to the outside world, from Srebrenica all the way up to Bijeljina. So it's a huge area on the one hand, but on the other hand, it was as I said, we only found out. I mean, when I say we in this particular case, I mean the world only found out about it and started believing it in August 1995, thanks to the late Madeleine Albright, who actually produced satellite imagery of mass graves being dug at the UN Security Council session in August 1995. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question,
great.
But yeah.
That's great. I think we can also talk about contested meanings attached to these places.
Okay.
Before we do that, maybe Jørgen can share or answer the question, what are the places of Utøya, so that we have this comparative approach to that.
Well, to start with, one thing you mentioned is the relationship between places. And what we see, for example, in Norway, particularly when teaching about what happened on 22nd of July, the relationship between Oslo and Utøya is important. We're not talking about one place, which is Utøya, we're talking about two places, Oslo being, for many, many people, forgotten. The bomb in Oslo. And I think, so just to mention that first, it's really important to see those two places together. Utøya is a tiny island in inland lake, a fjord in Norway. Being this tiny island, also a place, a crucial part of Norwegian political history for decades, an important place, the heart of the labor movement, and then, of course, the site of the worst terrorist attack in Norwegian history. And to have all that, of course, meant how should you deal with this place? How should you deal with a place that has that pain, that history, but also the need to balance the past with the future? And I think there's a lot of different aspects of all places that has a traumatic history, and to deal with them is, you can't follow one solution, you can't follow one path, but there are some similarities, and one of the similarities is you have to tell what happened there. And I think starting from that point on, you can make a lot of different choices. I don't know how much you want to tell of the story of Utøya afterwards, but I think for us it was important to say that Norway doesn't have the history, it doesn't have the traditions, doesn't have the kind of reflection of how to deal with terror, with mass violence. For us it was, we had to go through that process, and we had to go through it as in terms of the history of the place, but also the background of the perpetrators and the why the attack happened in the first place. So for us, for example, why is Utøya now still a living place? Well, it also has to do with that the perpetrator wanted to stop the activities of Utøya. He wanted to shut down the activities there for never to be returned. For us, it was an important message to send back that hope will prevail, life will come back, but also balancing then the needs for the survivors, the bereaved families, and trying to take all these discussions in and find a way forward.
When you say for us, can you elaborate a bit on where that project came from? Because I know there were a lot of conflicting narratives immediately after what should happen with the island. Some wanted to leave it as it was. Can you talk a bit about how you pushed through with that project and how you cooperated with those left behind and the victims?
Yes. So many of you might remember that just after 22nd of July, the Labour Youth organization AUF stated that we will return, we will come back. And that was an important signal because of many things. One, as I said, the perpetrator wanting to shut down the island, shut down the activities, kill off an entire generations of youth politicians. He shouldn't succeed doing that. On a more, on the level of society, for us it's been important to say that we cannot abandon all places, even those places that hurts. Pain has to also be dealt with in these places. But it's a difficult way forward, and you also need to balance, the need for the present with the need for the future. You need to balance how to tell this story, and of course the needs for the victims themselves. For us, I had a question of an American researcher exactly saying, what are the traditions, what are the history of in Norway dealing with such terror? And with that question, the answer was, we don't have any. But for us, it gave us quite a lot. It gave us inspiration to say that, well, then we just have to figure out these answers ourselves. And ourselves in this matter is very few people and a lot of people. Because we're a very small team working with this, but at the same time, Utøya involved so many. So what we did was basically trying to talk to each other. We set up an international group of experts, It's a long way from Manhattan to Utøya, but there's still quite a lot of similarities in the dilemmas we face. How do you deal with storytelling? How do you deal with the victims? How do you deal with finding this balance between the past and the future? The other thing was, we saw quite early on that if we are to make anything meaningful out of Utøya, we need to address those that had the direct effects of the attack, the survivors and their families. And I think that's been a key issue of why Utøya is what Utøya is today, is that trying to talk to each other, asking questions, what are your needs? How is it possible to upholding our principal view that the terror shouldn't win, so to say, life will come back, but at the same time trying to taking those considerations. So basically my job for 10 years has been traveling around the country, talking to families, meeting them, asking them these kind of questions, listening to them one-on-one. And by doing that, both, establishing trusts, but first and foremost, finding a way of kind of merging all these conflicting interests in a way where the the conflicting pair of interests were actually manageable. The biggest, I think, in the Facebook event, there's a picture of this one house, this building on Utøya. It's called Heimhuset. In Norwegian, it's not the most easy way to translate. It's not the most commonly word in Norwegian language either. It means the protective house, the house that embrace. And it's the only place on Utøya that has the physical wounds, the bullet holes in the walls, where you actually see and feel the evil is there. Because outside, nature somehow heals itself. If you walk on this small, lovely island in the fjord of Norway, the water comes, to the shores, the flowers come back every year, but inside, time stands still. And this kind of became the most contested question. Should we leave this building? Should we take it away? Many people that wanted it to be gone was also a way of saying, I want my own life to move on, and then I need to take away those kind of physical wounds. And then the other wanted, well, I need this in my life to be able to move on. The solution for us was to basically do both. We have kept the old cafeteria building where 13 young people were shot and killed, where you have the visible wounds in the walls, but kept it within a new structure, which makes the connection between what happened inside and the tenting area. Because this is still a tenting area. This is a place where 15-year-old people come to engage in political issues, to engage in whatever they find important, both the labor youth, but also a lot of other youth organizations. And to have that connection between what happened inside and life goes on the outside was crucial.
Right. Is this on? Yeah. Emir, with Utøya, the question was, what should we do with the island? And until that was settled, the island was there. In Srebrenica, it's a city. It moved on. New people moved in after the genocide. Instead of the question being, how should we deal with this that we have to deal with, which was basically the problem with Utøya and Srebrenica, life moved on regardless because of the continuation of the project that the genocide was a part of, essentially, if we think about it that way. So can you say a bit about how the Srebrenica Genocide Memorial, the story about Srebrenica, established itself within this context where Srebrenica essentially became a part of Republika Srpska after the genocide?
Well, let me just go back to what Jørgen brought up and what you now also sort of phrased as part of the question. I believe that the question, what do we do with this, is relevant to both Srebrenica and Utøya, and perhaps in some ways, on some levels in identical ways, but on some other levels in different ways. But the question was still there. The question for us was not what do we do with the physical location. The question for us was what do we do with this event? How do we process it, and how do we integrate this into our history, into our national narrative? What is it to us? What are the lessons that we should actually learn from this happening to us? And it was a very long, very convoluted, very confusing process sometimes. I remember, the first issue, there's one issue that hasn't been an issue for many other memorials. That's the issue of mortal remains. That's the issue of graves. I have friends over at the Kigali Memorial Museum. That is not an issue in Rwanda. It's simply not an issue. In the Holocaust, that's also not an issue. What do you do with the mortal remains that you find? What do we do with them? Which explains why the entire memorial actually started out as a cemetery. For very many years, the definition of success, and please take this success with heavy reservation here, was to find a handful of bones and bury them in Potocari, bury them in the place where their families last saw them for the most part, or in Srebrenica, in the general area of Srebrenica. The second was, okay, once we decided that we actually want to bury the victims of Srebrenica, where do we do it? And the issue was tabled, very early on, because we immediately started finding grave sites, mass graves. And there were ideas that we should do it somewhere closer to the territory that was controlled by the Bosnian government, by the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina between 92 and 95. And that is actually what gave rise to this unparalleled activism of families, mainly women. Mainly women because Srebrenica is gendercide as genocide, or genocide as gendercide. Men were targeted, men were killed. This was a very specific targeting of men and boys, and there is a reason behind it, and I can elaborate if you want me to. But I would actually rather talk about this group of women that essentially fought against all odds, that managed to impose their will on the decision makers in Bosnia, which wasn't necessarily difficult, let's be honest. It's not as if Alija Izetbegović or people from the Bosnian Republican government would oppose that. It's just that it was beyond them to do what the families wanted. They couldn't do it. So these ladies, and when I say these ladies, I don't mean, I look at the women here, they all look urban, socialite, like they're all urban, socialite, educated women. I'm talking about rural conservative women from eastern Bosnia whose lives up to that point were centered around their husbands, around their sons, and for whom back then you would have bet that they were going to fail, because they didn't have the skills, they didn't have the education, they didn't have anything that it would have taken for them to do what they did. And they managed to do it. And it was sheer willpower. And I've seen them literally talk, American ambassador in Bosnia, of high representative, they would literally talk them into submission. Literally. And I've witnessed some of these things, and this is amazing. There is no parallel for what they did. The only similar situation was that of the mothers of Plaza de Mayo. And then the women of Srebrenica. You know. So it was them who literally said, okay, no, this is not going to happen. The idea was once again to establish the cemetery somewhere closer to Tuzla. No. And they went around, they literally got to every single family, and they asked them, okay, where do you want your loved ones buried? Do you want it in Tuzla, do you want it in Sarajevo, do you want it in Srebrenica? Overwhelming majority said Srebrenica. So from that point on, and this is happening, all of this is happening in 97, 98, 99. I mean, you know, Balak Krisalovic, our new Bosnian ambassador here, he remembers that time very well. I mean, you know, we really didn't have a lot of idea about where Bosnia was going to go. I mean, we didn't have, there was uncertainty about the future of Bosnia. There were 50, 60,000 foreign troops there, but still, nobody really had a clear idea of where the country was going to go. And in the midst of all that, these ladies, you know, pushing for this basic human right to actually be able to have a grave site of someone that they loved and someone that they gave birth to and someone that they raised, getting getting it done. So the memorial actually started as a cemetery, but it also started as a private foundation, and it was a private foundation that was actually run literally by Office of the High Representative, American Ambassador. It had a steering board that had that comprised of American Ambassador, UK Ambassador, Dutch Ambassador. And then in 2007, this private foundation was it was declared to be a government institution by the Office of the High Representative. Interestingly enough, all of the other laws that were imposed by the Office of the High Representative, including the law on armed forces and the law on service in armed forces, were ratified by the Bosnian parliament. The only law that was actually imposed by Office of the High Representative and never ratified by the Bosnian Serbs in the state parliament is the law on the Srebrenica memorial. Never. Our steering board has a place in it for a Bosnian Serb member of the state parliament. It's never been filled. Never. They never delegated anyone to sit on the steering board of the Srebrenica Memorial, which is unfortunate, but is, you know, also a fact. So back in 2007, the institution became a government institution. We're partly financed by the government, but it really just covers basic costs. The rest, you know, Jørgen and I just had a conversation about how much time when managing institutions like this, how much time you actually have to spend fundraising. You know, in my case, it's about 2/3 of my time going around and you know, blackmailing people into giving me money. Anyway, so that's how the memorial really got where it is, and that's how it evolved. It would not have been possible without the families. It would not have been possible without the survivors, but mainly the families of the victims. And you know, now we are where we are. We're now in this process of memorialization. We're now in the process. You know, we're sort of transitioning towards a more conventional memorial center. Now, a lot of people have, you know, you are Bosnian, so you understand our, you know, it's a mentality thing. You know, we love to look back and then criticize stuff that someone else did or did not do. I mean, we love that. And you know, seriously, I mean, like the first question that you get, that I got, you know, some of the first questions that I got when I got there was like, yeah, you know, it's great that you're here. You know, I was like, the previous guy didn't do anything, and I know the guy actually did do a lot of good stuff, but no, that's Bosnia. So anyway, what we're doing now is really, but what I want to explain is that I'm not surprised that it took such a long time. Nobody should be surprised. It was, we have only began to actually center the story of Srebrenica itself, but we have also only begun to place Srebrenica within the larger narrative. You cannot look at Srebrenica without looking at the siege of Sarajevo, for instance. I mean, that is just, illogical. It doesn't make sense, because when you look at Srebrenica, when you isolate it, when you place it in a vacuum, then it doesn't make sense. It cannot be explained. So anyway, I'm sorry, it's a very long-winded answer.
I think we also have to hear more about this overarching narrative that you talk about and where you place Srebrenica.
Right.
Before we do that, I think this might be a good time for Iselin to talk a bit about Islamophobia as a motivating factor and ideology behind these two incidents. Maybe you can do that, Iselin, and yeah, present your notes.
Okay.
There you go. That thing doesn't work.
Yeah, this doesn't work, does it? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot for the invitation, Edin, and thanks a lot to my co-panelists for excellent introductions to this very bleak topic. My role here, I guess, as you say, is to introduce the topic of Islamophobia. I co-organize a project funded by the Research Council of Norway on Islamophobia, together with Hvilke, who's also here, and together with the Center for Extremism at the University of Oslo. And the aim of that project is really to explore Islamophobia as a global phenomenon through the analysis of intersecting flows and scalability. And one of the things that we have looked at recently is the notion of love jihad, the notion of Muslim male sexuality as something particularly threatening and something that native women needs to be protected against. This is a huge thing in Asia, and it's traveling the globe. And we look into these kind of themes that travel from one national context to another one. And then we seek to theorize Islamophobia as a global phenomenon. We want to go beyond the borders of the nation state, and we argue that this is something that cannot be fully explained within one particular national context. So that would go perhaps both for Srebrenica as well as for Utøya. And then we try to theorize how Islamophobic dystopias, because that's what we're talking about, is a dystopia about the future, a negative projection of the future if Islam takes over the world. This is the narrative, narratives that we look into, how they reconfigure particular notions of nationhood. And then, just very briefly, we know, of course, that Islamophobia is a very complex and highly politicized term. And its usage is contested, obviously, also within the academic community. I just have to say that. And it's used in different national contexts for different political purposes. But some of these discussions, in my view at least, is really about this. It's whataboutism. It's a way of sort of speaking about something else. We agree with the term, therefore the phenomenon it refers to does not exist. And that's dangerous. So if we can agree that what we refer to is anti-Islam and anti-Muslim ideologies and practices, emphasizing, essentializing and generalizing views on Islam and Muslims, and whether people then prefer to use Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism, or say anti-Islam and anti-Muslim ideologies and practices, which is very long, that's up, it's a very long debate. But at the core, it's really about essentializing and generalizing negative stereotypes about Islam and Muslims. So, at first glance then, I mean, these two places, Srebrenica and Utøya, do not seem sort of directly connected. I mean, we can do kind of a comparison of memorial sites, as you have done now. But are they connected in any way, directly? I mean, Utøya takes place 16 years later. Srebrenica takes place, or the Bosnian genocide takes place in times of war. Utøya takes place in a rather peaceful and democratic setting, right? But if we see ultranationalism and xenophobia as transnational phenomenon in themselves, as something which is not confined to these borders of the nation state, I do think that it allows us for a deeper understanding of the ideological motivations of far-right extremism. In fact, I would say that far-right ideologies explicitly make the connections between the two sides. And I think this is the clue. These connections are made out there in these far-right ideological universes. And I would go as far as to say that making sense of Utøya is not possible without making sense of Srebrenica, but not necessarily the other way around. And we can discuss that. That's a point for discussion, I guess. Or, put differently, we need to see Utøya in relation to global Islamophobia, the global far right, and what we may call resentment nationalism. And that is a form of nationalism which is focused on perceived internal enemies that are to blame for suffering and misfortune. And very often in these kinds of nationalisms, Islamophobia is the glue that sort of connects the global far right. And actually, in global far right ideologies, Bosnia and Serbia play a particular role. And this is where Utøya comes in. And if we look at Utøya as an expression of global Islamophobia, we could think of it in 4 different dimensions. And then what I'm saying now is really based on a reading of Behring Breivik's so-called manifest. It's really a copy-paste document. It's not really sort of his voice in a way. But he clearly has a global agenda. So the 4 points I would like to make is the global agenda, it's the co-writing, it's the global ramifications, and the global digital hatred that kind of strengthens and increases after 22nd of July. So the global agenda is, I mean, he sees himself as part of a contra-jihadist movement that is global in outlook. If you read the manifesto, I'm sure that many of you have looked at it, it's really, really global. It's about India, it's a lot about India and Hindu nationalism and certain historical events that he sees as crucial in the so-called Islamic imperialism, colonialism, and Holocaust, and he uses that word, on the non-Muslim population. So it's the Mughal rule in India, and then it's the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans. It's the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, and it's the Gates of Vienna. All is a kind of standard reference, and he writes a lot of long chapters on why the Bosniak population, the Muslims of Bosnia, are traitors and part of Turkish imperialism, right? And the text itself, it's really a transnational, intertextual document. It's copy-paste from various sources, and there's a lot from ultra-nationalist Serb networks directly copied in. So it's quite clear that part of his Islamophobic project, Serbia plays a vital role in that. He doesn't mention the genocide in Bosnia conveniently, right? But there's this narrative of Holocaust of Christians in Serbia. The co-writing, what I also find very interesting is that the co-writing, when you copy-paste, he very explicitly copy-pastes, very famous international contra-jihadist authors like Robert Spencer and Bat Yeour. And Bat Yeour, I'm sure that many people have heard about her. She is a British author of Jewish Egyptian background, and very famous for launching the theory of Eurabia, which is the conspiracy theory that political elites of Europe have conspired together with Arab Muslim political elites to Islamize Europe. And that's the rationale seen from this kind of global Islamophobic ideological formation. That is the rationale for attacking ALF and the Labour Party, right? As the political elites that are seen as traitors of the nation and therefore legitimate targets in this war of defense, as they see it, right? And his document is called the 2083 A European Declaration of Independence. And what is independence? Well, it's Islamic imperialism and genocide of white Christian Europe. Can I add something?
Sure.
Last point on this. As you know, 22nd of July had ramifications. So I think that we need to understand 22nd of July as a global phenomenon in itself, in its own right, that it inspired other right-wing extremists across the globe. Most famously Christchurch in New Zealand, which was a very explicit attack, right, on the Muslim community. So where Breivik thought that it was better to do the traitors first, Tarrant in New Zealand thought that it was better to stop Muslim demographic takeover at the global scale by killing Muslim directly. So they kind of agree on the aim here, but they prioritize differently, whether to do the traitors first or to do the Muslims first. So this is sort of the extremely violent imaginary we are in. And it inspired then Tarrant in Christchurch, and then later Philip Manshaus, who attacked the Al-Noor Mosque in Bærum in August 2019. And they all refer back to Breivik, right? So it's a kind of global circulation of Islamophobic hatred and violence. This circulation has, of course, intensified with social media after Breivik published his so-called manifesto, and these digital platforms where we see this kind of global co-writing of anti-Muslim hatred. What is interesting is that now and then the question of Bosnia and Serbia comes up in these debates. And I had a look at the far-right, though not far-right extremist platform called Reset here in Norway, where they also discuss Srebrenica. And there is an item there posted in 2017 by Helge Lurås, who is the director of Reset and who also served for NATO in Kosovo during the 90s. So he feels entitled to talk about the Balkans to a Norwegian audience. He does not celebrate the Bosnian genocide. He talks about it as a genocide. But, mind you, Bosnia in this case, in his political analysis to the Norwegian far-right audience, is to say, hey, look how multiculturalism works. This is the result. People with Christian or Muslim backgrounds can't live together. This is the lesson we should learn. So it's an argument for ethno-pluralism, that different groups should live separately. That's how this is portrayed. And then you read the commentary sections of that post, which is rather shocking, because then it's all about that the genocide was justified, that the problem was really the NATO's bombing of Serbia, and that NATO actually aided the Islamic imperialist project into Western Europe, beginning in Bosnia. This is Norwegian public debate in 2017 in certain far-right circles. So it comes back in a loop, and it's all about notions of Islamic imperialism and notions of the need of living separately. Shall I end there, Edin?
Yes, that was great. That was very great. Thank you. I would like to follow up on two things you said, beginning with Emir, and then Jørgen can get the final word. But first, Emir, Iselin used the term Bosnian genocide as opposed to Srebrenica genocide, and related this to Islamophobia. Can you tie these together for us, Bosnian genocide in Srebrenica, and the analytical concept of Islamophobia?
Okay, I'm not an expert on Islamophobia, but I do have some expertise on Bosnian genocide, and I can try and talk about that. First of all, let me start by saying that there are parts of, as Iselin said, there are parts of academia that refuse the term both Bosnian and Srebrenica genocide, and I just have to put it out there. It's unfortunately, fortunately, it's becoming less and less legitimate. But make no mistake about it, that you can actually be a credible university professor today and write that Srebrenica was not a genocide, or the Bosnia was not genocide. Robert Hayden, for one, and a number of other authors. So that's one thing that we knew. Second, the reason that I referred to Srebrenica earlier on as a genocide operation is precisely because it happened within the context of an attempt to eradicate an entire group of people that covered the width of Bosnia, and that lasted for 3.5 years. Now, the definition of genocide, I've actually, there's a great guy, I think probably the single most important author in genocide in the last 10 or 15 years in the West is Dirk Moses, and Dirk wrote a lot about this so-called language of transgression, and how the notion of genocide itself came about, and how much embedded Orientalism there is in the definition of genocide itself. Because all these concepts are based on words such as barbarity, shock, conscience, civilization. There's an entire, as I said, vocabulary of transgression. Now, there's more than one way to destroy any given group. Okay? You can, of course, go ahead and try and kill every single one, like the Hutu extremist government tried to do in Rwanda, and yet you will fail. You can, on the other hand, target men and boys, rape women, forcibly transfer the rest of the population, and destroy every single evidence that these people have ever lived there. You know, some genocides are more tied to geography, but it doesn't mean that they're less of genocide if they're more tied to geography. A certain community that existed in certain parts of Bosnia 30 years ago no longer exists in those parts of Bosnia. End of story. They're not the same community, you know, living in Norway or in Sweden as they are living in Bosnia. There's a lot about geography in genocide that has not been necessarily researched, explored, and so on. I'm a member of a certain community when I go back home, even today, and then I drive back to Sarajevo, and in Sarajevo I'm a member of a completely different community. And here I'm a member of a, you know, and it's all different levels of my identity, but one of those identities is actually more basic, more fundamental to who I am than any other identity. I don't know any of you guys. When I go back to Bratunac or Srebrenica, I know everyone there. We went to school together. We have memories to share. We share words, the same words for things. You know, we understand each other. I have a friend who I meet there when, you know, I mean, he's a friend, he's a neighbor, so I necessarily meet him every time I'm there. And then this American friend of mine came along and listened to what, you know, she actually is trying to learn Bosnian, so the two of us are sitting like this and talking, and at one point she goes, guys, come on, I mean, you guys sound like you know, like cowboys, you know, this is how you talk. And so anyway, that is long gone now, you know. But once again, and so that's one thing about, you know, why I consider that what happened in Bosnia between April 92 and October 95 is actually and was an attempt at genocide. Now, the extent to which it had to do with Islamophobia, I actually wrote about that. I wrote a few pieces, and I wrote an proper academic article about how Bosniaks were socially constructed into Turks, but I also wrote about, and I'd be more than glad to elaborate on that if you want, how Bosnian genocide was at the center of this. You know, Radovan Karadzic was the dark horse of far-right extremism in Europe. And when you're talking about this particular debate, you know, that where genocide is justified, it's justified as a preventative genocide, you know. And when you look at the archives, for instance, of the Bosnian Serb institutions from the period of 1992 to 1995, you will find a lot of this conversation about how Serbs are what do you call that? The
bulwark?
Bulwark of Christianity. The Latin term is ante morale Christianitatis and dates back to the Middle Ages. And it's still operative. It's a term, it's a notion more than a term that's still operative. And you can still hear, you know, in the Balkans, you know, here it's really within the province of far right, let's be honest. You know, no self-respecting Christian Democrat would actually talk in that manner. But you know, the farther south you move, the more mainstream it gets. All right. And you know, on a personal note, I was 14 years old, literally, it was 1989. It was the height of this, and there are people here who will remember anti-bureaucratic revolution. And I was in elementary school, and I was sitting next to a guy that I was sitting, you know, next to like for years, and he turned to me at one point and he said, you know, I mean, he swore at me, but he, you know, part of that was calling me a Turk. And I remember looking at the guy and like, what are you talking about? I mean, after that point in my life, I had never met a Turk. I had no idea how these people looked. I had no idea what, but I was really, mostly confused by him calling me a Turk. I mean, what? We were taught the same history, and in the history books that we were taught from, the Turks and the Ottomans were the occupiers, the Asian invader, the alien invader, whatever you want, I mean, all the. So what do I was really confused. I mean, what do I have to do with the Turks, man? Come on. Okay, I kicked his ass later on, but that's a different story. Now, but since the age of 14, I've been trying to explain to people that I'm not a Turk. First of all, I'm too tall. Okay. Secondly, I'm not a Turk. The language that I speak is a Slavic language. It's my mother tongue is a Slavic language, right? I grew up with. And then I realized that at the center of it all is really the fact that there was a mosque in my village. It was all about that, it was all about that particular object, that particular building, that the stuff that we did went inside that mosque that made us Turks. And it took me years, of course, later on to realize that it was actually Islam that was racialized in this process, and that for a lot of us, we will never be white enough. Even though when you go to, and this is a joke, so I hope, this is being streamed anyway. So I have a really good friend of mine, and he's a great anthropologist. He did research for his doctoral thesis with Bosniak community in St. Louis. And he wrote a great thesis and all the rest of that, but then one time we were sitting and joking, and he said, he said to me, what's the single most important moment in the development of the Bosniak community in the United States? And I'm like, no idea, how would I know that? The moment they realized they were white, and that it actually works for them. Because we never thought of each other in those terms. We don't think of ourselves in terms of white and brown and black. But then you realize at one point that the fact that you have fair, that you're fair-skinned and fair hair, and that you have blonde eyes or green eyes, doesn't really mean much. Because there's other things that don't make you white necessarily. Okay, so I don't know.
I hope somebody can follow up on that in the Q&A, and particularly somebody can ask a question about Europeanness and so on. So please, somebody.
Yeah, but ask your questions. Man.
Yeah, but I have a question to Jørgen, because we have a timeline here, time schedule, and I know you have your notes, Jørgen, you probably have a lot to say, but I want to ask this particular question because Iselin, she really illustrated the global network and the world view of, or rather the world view of Breivik, and how Islamophobia is intertangled in this and on the far right in general. And in your book, you make a little reflection on this. I have a quote. You seem surprised that you have a reflection on this. You write, using Utøya to fight far right extremism would be natural and important, but would it be right? Can you use some minutes to kind of elaborate a bit on that?
So one of the questions I receive regularly is, what's the basic, what's the principle, what do we need to do with places that has a traumatic history? Why do we do what we do in these places? And there are so many difficult choices, dilemmas, but I think always there will be a big aspect of we do what we do as a reaction of the kind of external factors. Why are we here in the first place? Why do we need to deal with this? And for us it was, of course, a matter of Breivik wanting to, Utøya to go dark, to shut down, and therefore to as I said earlier, to bring back life is is a reaction in itself. It's a statement in itself. For example, during the process afterwards, I don't have, the number of times on my phone or in my email, etc. Far-right groups, individuals try to basically make Utøya a memorial. Why do a far-right group want to make Utøya into a memorial? Well, because they wanted to achieve what Breivik tried to do as well, to stop the activities of Utøya. So that's a bit of the question there. Well, yes, Utøya could have become something different. It could have become a place only for teaching, learning about far-right extremism. But it is also the more reaction to the intent of what happened, which is bringing the labor youth back, bringing young people's engagement back. It's not only about teaching about what happened as such. So that is a bit of the answer there. I think, in the beginning, the first couple of years, we struggled about, what to do with Utøya. One of the most experts that contacted us directly or in the media, they were only referring to wartime situation of how to deal with places of atrocities. Why do we do the things we do? Well, for example, why do we need to tell the stories of what happened, which is important place or important part in many places? Well, it's also because that history is not set, it's not agreed on, and to tell the story, which does of course make sense on Utøya, but it's still a different thing, and why we did so. I just want to mention a couple of things as well regarding Breivik, the far right. First of all, it's quite obvious to many that Muslims are kind of his arch enemies of Europe in his worldview, and I think the need for a one-dimensional understanding of 22nd of July and far-right extremism, it's a problem for many things. To understand the need for the labor youth, for example, last year in part of the 10 years commemoration, the need for them to speak, well, we were attacked. It's not just attack on democracy, it's one of those dimensions. It's not the only one, but it's one of them. And of course the Islamophobic, anti-Islam dimension is a really important one. You mentioned the direct link to in his manifesto. I don't know, so you know much more about this, but one of the influencer he has is, and the name is not pronouncing it correct, but Suljagic.
Suljagic, yeah, he's a university professor from Belgrade.
Also advisor for
Serbian president, and he's a legitimate guy, completely legitimate guy in Serbia.
And also one of the influences of Breivik in his manifesto. So there is also, direct links here. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think just
his questions are unanswerable anyway.
But to take into all these details to understand, it's really important in these issues because it's so difficult.
Sure, Iselin. Yeah, quickly, yeah.
I agree completely. So it's more this. It took Norwegian society so long to even recognize that it was about politics, that it was actually about the Labour Party, and you know this story much better than I do. So this argument about bringing in Islamophobia is not to say that it's really about that. It's just bringing it in because it was kind of lost in public debate in Norway. So that was the point. So I think we agree on this.
Absolutely.
Several causes of this. Yeah.
But I just have to say here, we have thousands of young people come to teach, to learn, to commemorate, but also to find their political engagement. What can I do? And one of the questions or the realization quite a lot of young people nowadays have, this is just not just one story, is young Norwegian Muslims realizing, being on Utøya, saying, I am the target.
Mm. Yeah.
Because that part of their understanding of 22nd of July isn't there.
Mm.
So I completely agree with the importance of it.
Mm.
And I think it's also lacking in quite a lot of the discussions in Norway.
Okay, we made a pledge to open up for questions, and we're a bit over time already. So please raise your hand, ask in whatever language you like. Somebody will translate, and Denise will give you a microphone.
Just have to have microphone because of streaming.
I was a minister in the government who went to war on Kosovo as a result of Srebrenica. So sometimes you decide to do something and learn. And luckily for all of us, Putin attacked Ukraine. Because that had for a moment silenced the extreme right in Europe. Marine Le Pen, Salvini in Italy, perhaps not Republika Srpska, and what is happening in Bosnia. But it silenced a lot of people. It even made Donald Trump for some time irrelevant. But that must be built further upon, because there will be no time to relax after this. And all those people, all of you, have described why. So my mother was a German Jewish. So luckily for me, the Germans didn't win the war. So I'm here. And because of that heritage, it was very natural for me to pick up the fight of Bosnia. Very natural. Because you know the guy coming creeping around. It's not necessary to understand a language. You can see the actions and the behavior. So the Norwegian, but my problem in this house, 2009, we have a big meeting here on hatred and other questions. And I sat in the cellar of this building with 400 people. It was a question of how Muslims should behave and so on. By my side there was a young girl with a hijab, and I said in 2009, now it was 10 years ago when you went to war to protect Muslims in Europe. And she looked at me open-eyed and with a very big question. So in a Norwegian school, she had never learned that. Never. And it was nothing with her intelligence or perception and anything at all. So if you don't learn your history, even the nearest history, and I shall end my story. I looked up the figures which we don't speak about in Norway. So how many so-called Yugoslav prisoners and Yugoslavs were from all parts of previous Yugoslavia? 2/3 of them were killed by the Germans in Norway. Out of 4,200, 2,800 were killed. Out of 100,000 Soviet Russian prisoners, and they were Russians, Ukrainians, White Russians, and so on. 15,000 to 16,000 were killed. It's big numbers. So on Norwegian soil, certainly have Utøya in our generation. But if you can draw the lines from between the wars, through the Second World War and up to now, I think we shall do that. To be firm enough, to be firm in the days and months to come. So, but I wanted to present myself because it was not given that we should go to war, but we had to do it. Because we had known the stories from Srebrenica. And we had looked upon everything happening from between 1992 and up to 1995. So it's not a question, it's a reflection.
Thank you for your reflection.
And we are listening to wise people reflected and giving insight to all of us. So that was my reflection. I could not be here without adding that reflection.
Thank you, Elena. We appreciate it. Inan has a question, Denisa. He sits right there.
Thank you. I will ask my question in English. On behalf of the Union for Bosnian Organizations in Norway, which I represent, I would first of all like to thank the organization for organizing this panel, and to all the panelists say thank you very much for your speeches and for your thoughts, for sharing them with us. My question is to Mr. Suljagic. It was mentioned by the member of the Norwegian Nobel Committee that the idea in Norway was that the young Labour Party should not surrender. They should continue, and they should keep on. They won't be stopped. In Bosnia, there was a different outcome, because the perpetrators, they managed to get their own federative state, which today is recognized internationally as a part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So my question is, this state is today trying to change the narrative of what happened in Bosnia, what would happen in Srebrenica, of all the atrocities that happened around in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The question is, do you think that they have succeeded in changing the narrative? And further on, do you think that this attempt at changing the narrative is of any threat to the peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina today? And please also do touch the subject of what is going on in Ukraine right now, and the ideas that come from Moscow of trying to change the narrative of what is going on in Ukraine, and the idealism that is legitimizing the attack on Ukraine, if you may. Thank you.
Okay, then we have a mic here, it's all right, don't worry. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, yeah, cool. All right. Okay, I don't quite and fully agree with you in terms of the success of the Serbian nationalist project in Bosnia. Yes, it was bloody. Yes, gains that would not have been recognized anywhere else have been recognized in Bosnia. But no, I don't think that they are happy with what they got, and I don't think that Bosnia is still, at least theoretically and constitutionally, a unitary state. So it's not a federation of any sort. But let me try and address some of the other questions that you brought up, because they're actually important. The Bosnian Serb autonomy, or the Bosnian Serb government, has spent an inordinate amount of money and resources trying to rewrite and whitewash the history of the 90s. And to that end, they've even recruited individuals who, until a few years ago, were legitimate researchers. One of them, a legitimate Holocaust researcher, Mr. Gideon Greif. They've also recruited people from, there's a lot of fringe in academia, and Iselin can tell you about that. So, getting a professor of law from Japan to comment on the dissolution of Yugoslavia is not necessarily, and does not necessarily have to end up as a successful exercise. Now, what's important about that is that they felt emboldened to go ahead and try and do that, to try and explain away the siege of Sarajevo as, again, the struggle against international jihad, to try and explain away what happened in Srebrenica as a number of people just going off the rail, really, and exacting personal revenge and so on and so forth. I do not believe that they've succeeded, and the reason that I don't believe is that they've succeeded is that as a result of what they were doing, the families of the victims and the survivors and a number of NGOs advocating for that has actually managed to advocate for outlawing genocide denial. And I can tell you one thing. We at the Srebrenica Memorial, we have a very specific mechanism of monitoring the frequency and the intensity of genocide denial in the mainstream media. It has literally almost ceased in Bosnia and Herzegovina starting July 23rd last year, when amendments to the criminal law or the penal code of Bosnia and Herzegovina were introduced, criminalizing genocide denial. And the only places in the Balkans and pretty much in the world, outside far-right forums, where you can see genocide denial in the mainstream of media, mainstream of public opinion, are Serbia and parts of Montenegro. So no, I don't think they've actually managed to change the narrative. I don't think they've managed to impose their narrative. On the contrary, I think that the more, now there is a danger there that the more Bosnia was a, let's face it. I mean, there's a number of Bosnians here, so let's face it, people. Bosnia was a footnote in European history. It was treated as a footnote back then. It's treated as a footnote now. Unfortunately, our lives were torn apart. Our families were torn apart. Our lives were hijacked. Our cities deported, our villages forcibly transferred. And nothing, literally nothing in Europe or the rest of the world was riding on that. Nothing. We could have just as easily ceased to exist. As a nation, as a people, as a state. Easily, trust me. Way back, we have a minister in Norwegian government, former minister in Norwegian government. In 1992, the French president used to say that not every village qualifies to be a sovereign state, and that Bosnia doesn't belong to Europe. And most senior officials of the UK Foreign Office used to say that what was going on in Bosnia is painful but realistic restoration of Christian Europe. So we could have just as easily disappeared, and no one would have been the wiser, no one would have known. And we fought on. And that's where all the difference between Bosnia and Ukraine lies. What's decided in Ukraine is the fate of the world. What's decided in Ukraine is the future of all of us. What's decided in Ukraine is the future of international relations. Is it a rules-based international arena, or do big states just get to gobble up small states and move on? Do we go back to anarchy, or do we stick to some basic rules that we actually managed to formulate on the back, or on the back of another immense loss of life, which was the Holocaust? So that's where the difference is. And also, I can go on and on about this. What's happening in Ukraine is not a war. It's a politicide. It's an attempt by Russian Federation to wipe off Ukraine as a state, to make Ukraine what Serbia wanted to make out of Bosnia, a footnote in a history to be written in one case by Dobrica Ćosić or Srđan Trifković, and in the other by the future Ivan Ilyin or Alexander Dugin. The thing is, my brother, we were not important. Ukraine is the battlefield for the future of this planet. Trust me. All right, that's it. I don't know.
There's a question there, and then one in the back afterwards. Two in the back, yeah.
Ja, skulle bare, det er mer en refleksjon igjen på det som Jørgen sa, fordi det traff meg veldig personlig. Det skjedde for 2 uker siden, og jeg har en datter på 12, og anser meg selv som en sekular muslim, ikke sant? Ikke veldig opptatt av det, men hun har blitt veldig opptatt av AUF og politikk og alt det, og de lærte om Utøya på skolen, og akkurat det traff henne, at hun følte seg truffet fra begge kanter, som en fremtidig AUF-er og som en norsk-bosnisk jente. Så jeg synes det var veldig rørende det du sa, og jeg tror det er mange som opplever det kryss. Hva skal jeg si? At de har en target i panna fra begge sider, og det traff meg litt personlig. Ja.
Jeg tror vi kan gå videre.
Hello, hi. This is a bit of a reflection and a little question. Because it is important to remember with Bosnia that this is not the first genocide in Bosnia, it is the 11th one. And it all went back down to, and it builds off the Holocaust, but under the World War, a lot of Serbians took a lot of villages and they killed them whole after they took them over. My grandmother had escaped from one of them from East Bosnia into the west of Bosnia, and they let her and her family go because they were kind of like the mayor of the town, and the Serbian soldiers looked at them and said, you know, the mayor was nice to us, she can walk. And then they killed them all. So it's also to remember how I found a book randomly searching through the library about Murfa Hitlerjai, which was about a Norwegian girl who had been a part of RF, who had found out that her grandfather was a major Nazi, a major Norwegian Nazi, a Quisling of high proportions, who had volunteered to go on the East Front and massacre through Poland and Ukraine. Because the thing about Ukraine is also that is Poland, Lithuania, that is a part of Europe that has always defended Jews. Bosnia has also, from the Middle Ages, been the part of Europe that has been the place for Jews. And if you look into books about the Ottoman rise in Serbia, a lot of them are mad about Bosnia letting in Jews. Because the whole deal was that they just were supposed to, it's a very long story, but it's that traditional hatred, because it is passed from father to son. My mother had a friend whose brother died because he denied going into the army. He said, I'm not going to kill my friends. So we have to look at that a generational thing that is taught, because when I went to school, in school we were discussing what makes a Norwegian. And one of the Norwegian girls said, third generation, which is really odd coming from like a 7-year-old. Where would she learn that? From a family. And the people who came back from the East Front in Norway, they were not punished for their genocide that they had done on the East Front. It was later found out that they had done a lot more and were far more willing in their hatred. But the Norwegian government has said time had passed and they had their little punishment, so it was fine. So that reflection in Norwegian society that we haven't really looked on that hatred that we're taught through generations, because she found in that book that her father had told her about like the Frydenlund, who ruled the world, which is tied to the Jewish, and I tried to like convince her of these things, but she hadn't like caught up on it. Thankfully she hadn't been radicalized. But we have to remind ourselves that Utøya isn't like a vacuum thing. Norway has a very long tradition of Jew hatred. It is in our constitution. We put that in as like the second thing. So to remind ourselves that those who defended them are then, because they're not Christian in Europe. There's the whole thing that Bosnia switched from being Christian to Muslim, and that they decided to take them in. That those who are not will be looked down on. So how are we gonna?
We have some more questions, but if you want to.
Because I randomly found that book. Yeah. That is not put into schools in Norway. How is that going to be integrated?
We can take some more questions, and then we can maybe sum up at the end with some answers. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a rather short question. An important part of memorialization is to draw the lessons and to try to avoid these things in the future. So, as you mentioned, the glorification of genocide is still mainstream policy in Serbia, which is something the world has to deal with. Do you feel, how is the reception? How do you manage to reach out to decision makers in the world today, do you feel, to make these events, genocides, killings, less likely in the future? What is the reception of your work when it comes to future policy?
Is that for me?
Well, it can be for both actually, but for you first then.
Okay. Well, how can I say? The only way to deal with these, people ask me often, what's the best way, when to intervene to prevent mass atrocities and how to prevent mass atrocities. And the only way to do it, only more forceful, is what the West has finally come around to doing in Ukraine. And to do it very early on. You do not, if the dissolution of Yugoslavia was more important in, let's say, I don't like the word, but let's say geopolitical terms, and if the world, as a result of that, decided to intervene, let's say in July and August 1992, a lot more people would have been alive. As simple as that. Or if the world had decided not to intervene, but to arm the legal, internationally recognized army of the internationally recognized state. Bosnia was very unique in the sense that it was first recognized, accepted into the UN, and then stripped of one of the most basic rights that any member of the UN has under Article 61 to defend itself. Article 61 says nothing in this chapter, nothing in this charter is contrary to individual or collective self-defense. So it's a right of every member of the UN. I don't know of any other state that has been internationally recognized, that has fulfilled all the criteria to be internationally recognized, held a referendum, accepted into the UN, and then stripped of one of the most basic, if not the most basic right of any UN member state. So, my recommendation to policymakers that I talk to is go in, go early, and go strong. Because there's only one way to deal with the Slobodan Milosevic's and Vladimir Putin's of this world. There's only one language that these guys understand. As simple as that. And as for the other part, the genocide glorification and genocide denial, and maybe answering your question as well, I see that as the single most important and the single most serious threat to peace in the entire region. Because it's not only about the idea, there's an entire network of individuals and organizations around the idea of denying Bosnian genocide, of denying Srebrenica, of denying Prijedor, of denying Vukovar. You have to understand that the dissolution of Yugoslavia is a process that lasted for 10 years. It started in 1990 and ended in 1999. And it took the rest of the world 10 years to get to the point of saying, you know what? We've had enough of this Milosevic character, all right? Let's deal with this. Let's not allow him to kill another 100,000 people. So yeah, go in, go early, go strong. End of story.
Iselin would also like to, before the question, Iselin would like to comment.
And just to add to that, at the other end of the spectrum from high politics, it's education.
Exactly.
Building democratic resilience through education. And this is where I would like to bring, I spoke about right-wing extremism and global Islamophobia, but there is a process of mainstreaming Islamophobia, which is super dangerous in my view, that we are getting immune to it. We don't recognize it anymore. That what we actually is looking at is a very specific and conscious dehumanization of certain groups in society, which not only leads to political exclusion, but could end up in ethnic cleansing and genocide. And my research is really on Buddhist nationalism and forms of Islamophobia in Myanmar. Look at the Rohingya ethnic cleansing. Look, to what extent is a genocide or not is to be decided later in The Hague, but the point here is that there is a political agenda of excluding a given group in society, excluding them explicitly from citizenship rights, excluding them from the political community. And that kind of rhetoric was so internalized by the Burmese majority society that they didn't even recognize the gross human rights violations against the group. So the democracy movement in Myanmar would talk up and down about the need for democracy, and when you mentioned the Rohingya, they all turned kind of.
That's like Serbia and Bosnians. You know, like even the most liberal people in Serbia, when it comes to Bosnia, they go like, not really, you know.
Yeah.
Not really fully on board.
Exactly.
You know.
Yeah. So in order to make people aware of these mechanisms, education.
I agree.
Yeah.
We have a question here.
Yes.
Yeah.
My name is Ola Elvestuen. I sit in the parliament here in Norway for the Liberal Party, same as Odeina. Also been in the Norwegian government for a little while. It's really hard to hear in many ways when I talk about the Bosnian War as a footnote in history. But of course, when we think back in the 90s, I think a lot of people in the Western Balkans get very provoked when we talk about the 90s as a decade of optimism. Because that's what it was for the rest of Europe. That was a decade of optimism. And I think also the writer made some enormous mistakes. Especially the weapons embargo that was imposed, major mistake that was done there. So it really could have been done and happened very differently without that horrible events that was there. But my question is really, there is a worry about the development in the Western Balkans and Bosnia also today. So can you elaborate a little bit about the expectations for the future? There's an election in Bosnia and Herzegovina this year, and is there a real danger, or is it still a Western Balkan that is still moving with all its faults but still in the right direction?
Okay. I don't think we're moving anywhere at this point in time, okay? But maybe no movement is actually good news. Now, let me be straight. I was really concerned about Bosnia until, let's say, 3 or 4 months ago, when Mr. Dodik and his ruling party declared an intention to re-establish the Bosnian Serb army. Now let's call the spade here. That would have been a red line because simply that's the army that committed genocide. And to ask us to coexist with an institution that perpetrated genocide would not have been possible. Very simple. I mean, this is how it is. It's like, for me, I know it's not a proper analogy, but it would be for, you know, for many of us, it would be what the state of Israel would feel if the German state decided to reactivate one of the SS divisions. Okay, I know it's not a proper analogy, it's a very rough analogy, but I just want to share the sentiment here with you. Now, what happened when Russia attacked Ukraine, and when the EU and the United States decided to stop dragging its feet and come crashing down pretty much, although, you know, the economic sanctions could be and should be stronger, and I think that Europe should be weaned off of Russian oil and gas. But what happened is that the rhetoric, you know, once people like Dodik and others saw what was going on, the rhetoric has really dampened. I have to be honest and say that. Our biggest problem now is actually coming from an EU member state, which is Croatia. And Croatia has been meddling in the Bosnian affairs, and especially in terms of, you know, I'm pretty sure that with the election law and the attempt to literally impose an apartheid-like solution in Bosnia. So that has been, over the last, let's say, month and a half, 2 months, that's been far more destabilizing than anything that Dodik could have or would have wanted to do. He's now having issues of his own. He's now facing criminal charges. Yesterday, he was actually interrogated by the prosecutor's office for some property purchases in Serbia back in 2007 or 8, doesn't matter. So the way I see it, I don't think there is, right now, there is potential for actual serious violence. There was a possibility, however tiny, but still serious back, I don't know, back like 3 or 4 months ago when he was talking about, reestablishing Vojska Republike Srpske, blah, blah, blah. That could not have flied. I mean, let's be honest, that would have meant immediate and massive violence. Now that seems to be off the table, or he seems to have been scared by what happened to Russia. He's still got friends in the EU though, people like Viktor Orban, people like Janez Janša, maybe some other, maybe I'm missing someone. Zoran Milanovic, the president of Croatia, all the friends of Mr. Putin anyway, and they now seem to be advocating on behalf of Mr. Dodik, but nobody is, and that's also a fair assessment, I believe, that none of them would be willing to back him going all the way. There is obviously some business interest there. As far as I know, Hungarian energy companies are involved in building solar power plants in Bosnia, in Bosnian Serb territory. So I mean, that's a very haphazard way of summing it up. But try and answer your question in one short sentence. Yes, there is reason for concern. No, I don't see potential for violence now. If you want to, and I know for a fact that Norway has always been part of that, if you want to do something for Bosnia, help us strengthen our armed forces, help us train our armed forces, help us integrate our armed forces. Our armed forces are, and that was one of my biggest concerns when I was in the Ministry of Defense, are still segregated. Help us integrate our armed forces. Help us train our armed forces with NATO. I know once again Norway has been heavily involved together with the Americans. I don't think there is a third country that even comes close in terms of in terms of building and establishing our armed forces. So that's one thing to do. The other thing is start at least talking about bringing back foreign prosecutors and foreign judges, because the moment it all went haywire is the moment that Catherine Ashton went to Banja Luka and agreed to Mr. Dodik's advice that foreign prosecutors and foreign judges should leave the state court and state office of the prosecutor. That is when it all went haywire. So these are the two things that even in the short term would make a ton of differences. Okay.
I think that has to be the last question. We're already 50 minutes overdue.